We are talking today with Kevin Phillips. He is the author of 11 books and in town to talk about his latest book, American Dynasty, Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush. Kevin, thank you for sharing time with us today.
My pleasure.
If you would start out and tell us why this book and why now?
Well, the basic premise of the book, as I started it, was the question of dynasties, and this dynasty in particular, because for the first time we had a oldest son of a president elected 8 years after his father left office. His name was almost identical. His mannerisms were similar. The people involved in funding the campaign were many of them the same. It was a continuity. It fit the term dynasty on the highest level. Previous dynasties have not been able to get a second president in a similar framework. We had, for example, we had an Adams, but the Adams came 24 years after his father had left office and in a different party, so there wasn't any continuity to speak of at all. With Roosevelt, we had Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, and again, quarter century apart. So no parallel here. This is something entirely new. I thought the newness of it was worth pursuing. Now, as I did pursue it, what I found was that the nuance that kept coming up was that this dynasty goes back 4 generations. The founding fathers were George H. Walker, a St. Louis financier, and Sam Bush, who was an Ohio Steel Company president. And a lot of what they did that got them into the power structure nationally came about as a result of World War I and the early stages of American global importance as a source of military supplies, and then as a participant in World War I, and afterwards as the leading creditor nation in the world, and the balance of power of money swung to the United States. And in the next generation, you had Prescott Bush, who was a senator from Connecticut elected in 1952, but by the end of the decade, his wife is reporting that he thought if he'd gotten involved earlier, he could have been president. And by the early 60s, the current president, George W. Bush, at prep school at Andover, was already talking about how his father wanted to be president, although he hadn't been elected to anything yet. So they've been thinking about it a long time. The dynastic aspect is very important because they have shared interest groups, shared antecedents, shared commitments to finance, oil, defense, and then they've had a shared relationship in each generation. It's been there with elements of the national security state and the intelligence community. And that has been a very, very shaping thing, and that surprised me.
I'm wondering if we can go into a little more detail on the beginnings of this dynasty. You had mentioned George Walker and Sam Bush. Can you give us a little more detail on how they came into their power?
Well, George Walker was a St. Louis financier, and he rose to some significance during World War I when he was involved in both wartime finance and the beginnings of the industry in the United States providing munitions for Britain and France. There was a huge demand for American war material, and he was involved in that. A number of his friends were in powerful positions in Washington, and he made such good connections during the war that in 1919, Averell Harriman, who was heir to a major railroad fortune, he enlisted George H. Walker as his partner in a firm called W.A. Harriman and Company. And together they got very involved with investments in Germany and Russia. Now, investments in both countries were, I can't say easy to arrange, they were difficult to arrange in Russia, easy in Germany, but they bore the prospect of being extremely fruitful because both countries have been devastated by the war or by revolution, and they thought they could make a lot of money out of this. Now, in doing these investments, They became very closely involved with the State Department, the various government agencies. They were involved in a number of different corporate relationships, and some of them involved hiring people who'd been in the intelligence services. So they made some powerful connections. The other great-grandfather, because these two, George H. Walker and Sam Bush, are great-grandfathers of the current president. Sam Bush was the head of Buckeye Steel in Ohio. It was a company that was partly owned by the Rockefellers and Standard Oil. And the president of Buckeye, who preceded Sam Bush, was Frank Rockefeller, who was the youngest brother of John D. In 1917, Sam Bush went to Washington as the head of the Small Arms, Ammunition, and Ordnance section of the War Industries Board. In that role, he regulated in a very significant way giant companies like Remington Arms, that was the leading producer of rifles and pistols and ammunition for the war. After the war was over, he went back to Ohio, but the connections he had made resulted somehow or other in his son, Prescott Bush, meeting George H. Walker's daughter in St. Louis, where Prescott Bush, Sam Bush's son, was working for one of the major war contractors after the war. So you had a coming together of Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker, and Prescott Bush then went where his father-in-law, George H. Walker, was, which was W.A. Harriman and Company. He went there in 1926, and then it became Brown Brothers Harriman. So Prescott Bush really came into the swing of things in New York largely because of his father-in-law, but partly also because of his father and his own Yale connections with people who were part of the post-war financial crowd in New York in very powerful positions. We have to jump ahead now to Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather of the current president, and by the end of the 1930s, he still has some connections with Germany and Russia from the businesses that were set up back in the 1920s by his father-in-law and W.A. Harriman. So one of these, and this is one that's gotten a lot of attention, but it's very much misrepresented. He was a director in the late 30s, Prescott Bush, of something called the Union Banking Corporation, which was set up in the 1920s by Harriman and Walker in connection with the German Thyssen steel family. They owned the biggest steel company, which became very important during the 1930s as a principal source of Hitler's war production. So in 1942, the alien property custodian in the United States in the Justice Department seizes the assets of the Union Banking Corporation because it was German connected. At this point, you have Prescott Bush as a director of this company. Now, this is the reason why some internet sites just go off on a tangent and link the Bushes and the Nazis. What really seems to have been involved here is that by the 1930s, as the United States faced a difficult situation with Germany, Prescott Bush and some of his colleagues on the board of the Union Banking Corporation, who came from the same firm as he did, started getting in touch with governmental authorities to see what to do about this. And they approached the New York State banking superintendent, for example, and he told them to stay put. So it's not as if they were, by this point, doing anything that the government authorities didn't know about.